Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. According to Oxfam, South Africa is the most economically unequal country in the world. The wealth of the two richest citizens outstrips that of the poorest 50% of the population, some 26 million people. How come 20 years after the end of apartheid? Well, my guest today is Naidoo, leader of the South African trades union movement during the liberation struggle and a cabinet minister under President Nelson Mandela. Why hasn't freedom reduced inequality? Naidoo, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you, Stephen.
Let us start with this Oxfam report that came out last year, which I frankly found staggering. They concluded that South Africa today is pretty much the most unequal society in the world. Did that surprise you as much as it surprised me?
No, because we have always been near the top of the Gini coefficient as one of the most unequal countries in the world. And if you go back to decisions we made, remember, democracy has been there for 20 years. And what we addressed was the political deracialization that was a political miracle then. It's still a political miracle today. But part of what we did not engage in and do decisively was deal with the question of economic freedom and economic restructuring, which is a lot more complex than even the political process.
Well, sure, it's complex, but what I found shocking isn't so much that there's great inequality in South Africa. I mean, I guess most people who look at the country know that. But the direction of travel is actually backwards. That since 1994, the triumph of the liberation struggle, the installation of President Mandela, since 94 to today, inequality has actually risen. How can that be?
Well, that's as scandalous to you as it is to me, and I think that requires some tough decisions to have been made very early on, and those are decisions that we did not take. And part of it is to, for example, address some of the levers that would change that, which would be education. We invest a tremendous amount of resources into education, more than any other country in Africa, but our outcomes are worse than many African countries, and that's not related to the access to education, which we have now guaranteed to every student. It's about the quality of education, and that means dealing with the systemic and structural issues around education. So if you go through that systematically, you go through the economic sphere, and you look at whether we are creating jobs, the reality is that we are sitting with 1 in 4 South Africans without a job. And that's related to the structure of the economy. Are we doing enough?
And a quarter of South Africans, it seems, according to Oxfam, regularly going hungry.
Absolutely.
I mean, so there's just a basic food issue here.
Yes, and it's about it has to go beyond the policy framework. What we did do in the first 5 years is create, on the back of a foundation, a constitutional democracy, the policy framework.
Yeah, but and let me stop you there, because you're talking about those first 5 years. It is important to remember President Mandela appointed you as his first minister, I think, of reconstruction and development. So you were front and center in the decisions made in those early days. Is it now time for perhaps for you, a rather difficult mea culpa on behalf of yourself and maybe even President Mandela as well, that there was a certain naivety, a belief that if you used the language of reconciliation, you had the great image of the rainbow nation, and if you put the focus on building a wonderful constitution with all those freedom guarantees that there were, that somehow the economics of the post-liberation era would work themselves out. And on that basis, you were just plain wrong.
Yes, I think we made some tremendous mistakes in that period, which I acknowledge. There's nothing wrong with our Constitution. In fact, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, talks very specifically about individual rights, but it goes beyond that to talk about second and third generation rights, even in relation to the land issues, that the issue of redress was fundamentally a legal principle in our Constitution. Did we have the political will to take some tough decisions to make sure that happened? And I think that's one of the mistakes we made.
And maybe there was a generational thing. Maybe the people who had struggled so hard and for so long and made so many sacrifices to get to the point of liberation weren't necessarily the people to take on the mantle of building the right framework for a new South Africa. Just the words of a woman we had on the show not so long ago, Mamphile Rampele. She says, in '94, we should have thanked the warriors of our struggle, decorated them with gold and let them go so that we could build the right democratic dispensation.
Well, I understand what she's saying, but I don't believe in that, because I think really the political will was there to change the material and objective and subjective conditions of every citizen in our country.
What we saw after '94, and it maybe got worse in the years after that, was people who'd been involved in the liberation struggle, some of the biggest names, becoming tied into a very small economic elite who were making millions, if not hundreds of millions, from their control of the levers of political power. And it didn't look right, and it seemed to involve, frankly, your generation of strugglers.
Absolutely.
Did you benefit yourself from that?
No, because I think that what happened was that was a reality. We were arguing that there had to be a negotiation around how we restructure the economy, particularly an economy coming out of the shelter of sanctions and dealing with precisely those questions of job creation, of industrial policy, of training. And that was put on hold. And what was it replaced by was a policy around black economic empowerment, which was a transfer of wealth to people who were politically connected.
But with no trickle down, just by and large a transfer to people who were already doing pretty well because of their connections, and then did enormously well as a result of what they got
Stephen,
from the program.
I would argue that it was a trickle up. In fact, it became a tsunami.
Absolutely.
So that you did end
the
up
opposite
with
of
people.
trickle down.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so today we have a president who is assailed on many sides in South Africa for some of the, how should we put this, some of the lifestyle decisions that he has been involved with, not least the $20 million US and more of refurbishments of his own residence. We have a deputy president who used to be a union colleague of yours, who's now deemed to be one of the richest men in South Africa. This is the reality of the ANC today. Are you still a member of the ANC?
Well, I'm not carrying a card for the political party, and that's part of my overall view.
You've actually quit the party?
Well, I'm not active in the party.
Well, no, just answer.
Yeah.
I mean, a straight question, because it's a very important one in South Africa. Your attitude to the ANC. Do you regard yourself still as a loyal member of the ANC?
No, I consider myself part of an ANC that I was part of, which won us our freedom. But today,
you can't say no, can you? I mean, why can't
no,
you just
because
say to
we do sit with that political baggage.
If you've rejected the ANC, just come out and say it, and say they are now rotten. The leadership of the ANC has led it so poorly and so badly, I no longer want to be associated with it.
No, I think I make a distinction between the ANC that I was part of and the ANC that exists today. And so, yes, I do disagree with many of the decisions that the ANC leadership does make today and the choices they make. But at the same time, you've got to balance that with the fact that the ANC, there are millions of people that do have a better life today than they had before democracy, before 1994. But do I have criticisms? Have I made that public? Absolutely, I have made that public statement.
If we are on the sort of track of discussing whether mea culpas are required, one key decision that you were central to back in the mid-'80s, before the triumph of the liberation struggle, was the decision to, in essence, marry the trades union movement, the COSATU as it became, the Congress of Trades Unions, directly to the political movement, the ANC, to, in essence, tie the unions to the ANC. Do you now look back and think that was actually a rather grave mistake?
At that point in time, with a country where we were sitting at the precipice of a racial civil war in the country, and the country required stability, it was the correct decision to, as a trade union federation, we weren't a political party, to ally as an independent organization with a political party.
Come on, you lost your independence. You became a part of
not
the
at that
ANC
point.
movement. That's the reality.
That was not at that point. I mean, a trade union movement will form alliances with political parties in order to achieve their political objectives. That is a norm across the world. The fact of the matter, it was around a program. That program was a reconstruction and development program. When that program was abandoned by government and the ANC, the leadership of COSATU should have said, is this alliance delivering what we want as workers and the poor in the country?
But you never said that, did you?
I stepped down as the leader
but you could have said that even after you'd stepped down, but you never did.
Well, I think, not at that point, but, I don't think that is my role.
But the point is this. Martin Plaut, he used to actually be the Africa editor here at the BBC. He's now an independent commentator. He knows South Africa very well, and he's written about this. And he says the decision of COSATU to directly support and be allied with the ANC was the beginning of the slow death of the independent union movement that so many had sacrificed so much for. And he thinks you actually have to take some of the blame for that.
Sure. I made a decision. It was a decision guided by a collective discussion within the organization. If you ask me today, is the alliance between COSATU and the ANC producing results that benefit workers in the country? And I'll say no. I think that...
Is it time then, because this is a very active debate in South Africa today, post the Marikana mine tragedy, with the shooting dead of so many miners by South Africa's security forces, and the feeling that the National Union of Mine Workers failed utterly to represent the real interests of so many mining workers. There are other unionists, some, for example, the leader of the National Union of Metal Workers in South Africa, who say no. We have to break the link with the ANC, we have to independently represent our workers, and frankly, we have to start to build a new set of civil society organizations, workers and community movements, which one day could become a workers' political party. Would you be supportive of that?
Well, I think if you ask me the question about what is COSATU today in its alliance with the ANC...
Just answer the questions I'm asking you, rather than frame them the way you want them. Would you support...
Stephen, I'm saying that today, in my mind, personally, the alliance between COSATU and the ANC does not make sense to me. That is causing tremendous division within COSATU. It's causing COSATU to implode. And in that process, the rights and the that workers have won over a long period of time, that's being undermined. So today, we have an opportunity for the trade union movement, and our aspiration always was for one federation. There are 3 major federations in South Africa. There is an opportunity today for the 3 federations to come together and form one organization on the basis of independence from any political party.
So not affiliated in any way to the ANC?
Not affiliated to anyone, including the ANC.
But I asked you also about the notion that is abroad now to create a new workers' movement that could, in the end, I think they're calling it a united front, could become a new political party. Well, the thing is, there is already one political party that says it absolutely stands for the interests of the poor and the working class in South Africa, and that's Julius Malema's Economic Freedom Fighters Party. Do you believe that Malema is onto something when he says that the interests of the poor and the workers are no longer represented by the ANC?
I think Malema has his finger on the pulse of an anger, a very deep, unending anger that is rising in the squatter camps and in the townships of South Africa, particularly amongst young people. I think there is a realignment of politics taking place in South Africa, which is very interesting. And I think it creates new opportunities for there to be different political parties.
Mandela never talked about things like mandatory confiscation of farmland. He never talked about nationalizing the mines. Malema talks about those things. With your experience and your unhappiness about the failings of post-liberation South Africa, are you now prepared to talk about those things?
Of course. I think the land issue... No, I think the land issue is central to us deepening democracy and making democracy work. It's about ownership of your home, ownership of land, the right...
So mandatory confiscations.
No, I don't
because
think
if you look at where the wealth lies in South Africa and where the agricultural wealth lies, you know it's still predominantly in the hands of a small white elite.
But Stephen, if you come back to politics, when we started the political negotiation, the National Party stood on the platform of saying we want veto rights for the white minority. We want a federal system. And we shifted that conversation through negotiations to a point where we agreed the shared interest of all South Africans was one person, one vote in a unitary, non-racial, democratic South Africa. I believe through a negotiating process, because that's what we are. Trade unionists are pragmatists, but they're tough negotiators. Through a negotiating process, we would be able to reach an agreement on the fact that land has to be addressed. And we can do that without going and confiscating people's land. There are many white farmers today that are prepared to have the conversation about sharing land with families that are living on their land. They're not the majority.
Yeah, I was going to say, who are these white farmers that you're talking to? Because that's not the message I get from most white farmers I hear and see in the media.
Yes, but you know, at the end of the day, there's a leadership that you've got to engage. You've got to create the conditions. The alternative...
But at the end of this day you keep talking about, you also, as a South African, have to take decisions about how far, in the end, the state is prepared to go to force this to happen if not enough white farmers volunteer to be involved in it.
But the Constitution doesn't prevent that. The Constitution is very clear on the issue of redress of apartheid and the inequity of apartheid. So you can pursue the issue of land, access and ownership by the black majority through constitutional means. We can test out those principles in the Constitutional Court.
And briefly, the other issue is control of the huge commodity resources that South Africa possesses. You know, I'm thinking of the mines. Now, the Marikana disaster exposed one thing which people found interesting. That is, for example, the company that controlled the mine, Lonmin, had on its board at the time, no longer, but at the time, Cyril Ramaphosa, who I've mentioned already, yes, a former leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, a colleague of yours, now one of the richest men in South Africa. There have been some calls based on leaked emails which showed Ramaphosa encouraging the police to take action against what he called the criminal activities of the strikers. Calls for Ramaphosa and others to face the full force of the International Criminal Court. Would you support that?
Well, I think that'll be an outcome of the commission that is taking place at the moment, and they need to investigate. And if that's true, then they should face the consequences, people who have breached the law. I think that the issue of the mining sector and the fact that BE did not work for the majority of people, for communities or for the workers, and you had the explosion of Marikana, is a problem of enforcement. It isn't a problem of principle. The mineral rights in South Africa all belong to the state. They are nationalized. People get a license to mine, and in that license is a very detailed process about a social plan around community development and a plan around a labor plan, which is about benefiting the workers. Those plans have never been implemented. And part of our challenge in South Africa is not about new policy, it's about implementation of policy that is there on the statute books and rights that are in our Constitution.
One thing it may also be about, and this is sensitive, and it's about a mindset more than anything else, is about perhaps the rise of another racial problem in South Africa, and that is a feeling abroad in some quarters that today's ANC, and maybe this is true for several years now, places more credibility and a certain form of superiority on black South Africans, and that others who had been part of the struggle, including ethnic groups such as your own, the Indians in South Africa, and the whites too, are finding increasingly that they don't have a place at the top of the ANC. Do you feel that?
No, I feel South African. And I feel I have a space. I'm
actually talking about the ANC. I'm not asking whether you feel South African. I'm feeling whether you feel today that the ANC is as open to all races as it ever was.
Well, that's hard to say. You know, I think that increasingly minorities are feeling threatened. They're feeling like the ham in the sandwich. That's a normal in any country where there are minorities. I think, I think that what's more dangerous for me, what's more dangerous for me that I see a rise of is tribalism. And tribalism, we know, is deadly in terms of creating conflict. And I think
Are you
that's
saying
what,
there are forces inside the ANC that are encouraging tribalism?
there are forces within South Africa that are encouraging tribalism. There's forces within South Africa.
Who, at a senior level, who has influence in these matters, would you say today, you could point at and say, you know what,
No,
they're
no,
playing
no,
a dangerous game. They are approaching public life, politics and power with a tribal sensibility.
What I think the important thing about the ANC is that it's a non-racial party. It's always reflected an anti-tribalist point of view.
Well, Rabelani Degada, an economist at Wits University, he recently wrote what became a controversial blog post suggesting that the ANC is now, his words, a racist and black African supremacist party.
I disagree with that. I don't think.
And yet your relations with the very top members of the ANC in recent years have been very poor. And you can point to people like Trevor Manuel. He too has seen his relationships with top ANC figures sour.
You know, but those are disagreements. I can have a disagreement with the leadership of the ANC. At a formal level, no one has pointed the finger at me and said, I'm disagreeing with you because you're from an ethnic, by ancestry, from an Indian ancestry. There's not that obvious attempt to try and create those divisions like there was in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis. So I think there are signs that is emerging in the conversation, even within our townships, between people who are South Africans and people who come from the rest of Africa, the xenophobic feelings. So all of these things will start to gel in a context where there's no pathways to hope and opportunity. So there's competition over scarce resources, and that competition creates conflict.
A final thought, and this reflects your current role as, I think, the chairman of the board of an NGO called GAIN, which is committed to improving nutrition across the world and is trying to help hundreds of millions of people who do not get, first, enough to eat, but second, the right sort of vitamins and nourishment within their food. It just seems to me that South Africa, to most outside observers, ought to be a country where that isn't an issue, but it patently is. As you've said, the record suggests up to a quarter of South Africans are going to bed hungry. Is it actually harder to address that issue in South Africa than it is in some other developing countries?
Yes.
Why?
Because, one government has to lead in that. And I think what we are challenged with in South Africa is an incredible arrogance of government thinking that it's not a problem. Solving a problem of hunger or malnutrition or any other problem requires people in leadership to say, we have a problem. And so we find that in the role that the foundation, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition plays, South Africa is not, we don't work in South Africa. We work in many countries, over 35 countries around the world.
They don't want to admit that they have this problem.
Yeah, and it just requires a different strategy and cooperation between the agricultural ministry, the health ministry, different departments of government. It requires a relationship with the farmers. It requires working with civil society. It requires working with private sector. We've got to have government having the right regulations to improve safety quality. And so these requires a very integrated approach to solving a problem. And I think that what's happened in our country is that we've ended up as a government where each department and each ministry is almost operating on its own. And part of it is saying, how does government work with players and stakeholders outside of government to solve the challenges that we have? And the most important part of that is communities.
We have to end there, but Naidoo, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
A pleasure, Steve.
Thank you.